Welcome back to Bizarre Books, the channel where I narrate the books that no one else will. Some may find content from this channel disturbing, so viewer discretion is strongly advised. If you derive value from this channel and want to support my efforts, please consider donating via the links provided in the description below this video. If you do donate, you can request a specific book or chapter that you'd like to hear me narrate. The Gates of Janus by Brady, Chapter 5. The reasonable man adapts himself to the world. The unreasonable one persists in trying to adapt the world to himself. Therefore, all progress depends on the unreasonable man. George Bernard Shaw. Many variations of the amoral interpretation of dualism are found in the sphere of criminology. For instance, is it not self-evident that the detective, in order to outwit the criminal he hunts, must not only be able to duplicate the, for want of a better word, abnormal thought processes of his quarry, but also strive to excel in corrupt faculties? The serial killer and the detective, to a significant extent, necessarily share many characteristics, including a common unorthodox philosophy in tandem with solitary dedication and commitment. Both protagonists must be ruthless in purpose, astute in deceit, clear in strategy, temper self-confidence with caution, cultivate doubt where there is certainty and certainty where there is doubt, feign incompetence to provoke overconfidence, nourish arrogance by fake humility, deny, affirm, and divert with dexterity as tactics dictate, incite anger to obtain the unguarded response and sow confusion, exude synthetic sympathy for trust whilst doubting everyone, regard all individuals as essentially corrupt and guided by self-interest, live and breathe moral and legal relativism whilst projecting moral and legal rectitude, and, above all, as already postulated, believe and act in the certainty that the end always justifies the means. Not that any homicide detective would publicly admit to owning most of the above amoral qualities or killer instincts. In this, they are much like their brethren in the Vice Squad, who, in reading and viewing pornographic material every day, year in, year out, to assess whether they are liable to render the public depraved and corrupt, nevertheless claim self-immunity. To successfully deceive others, they must, to a significant degree, deceive themselves. Quote, "Reason is a thing we dimly see in sleep." End quote. The Birds Fall Down, Rebecca West. The captured serial killer, with no hope of freedom, invariably sloughs off the debilitating scales of hypocrisy and sanctimony, hazards self-analysis, and indulges the luxury of cynical honesty, which can no longer further or hinder lost ambition. Disinterest keens an omnipotent view of the human chessboard. Quote, "By thy cold breast and serpent smile, by thy unfathomed gulfs of guile, by the most seeming virtuous eye, by thy shut soul's hypocrisy, by the perfection of thy art, which passed for human thine own heart, by thy delight in others' pain, and by the brotherhood of Cain, I call upon thee and compel thyself to be thy proper hell." End quote. Lord Byron. The term serial killer is used to describe a person who kills spasmodically over a comparatively lengthy period of time, as opposed to the mass murderer who usually kills all his victims in one bloody scenario. It is generally accepted that the FBI's National Center for the Analysis of Violent Crime headquarters in Quantico, Virginia, originated the formal concept of psychological profiling, a method of projecting the probable traits and characteristics of an unidentified, usually violent criminal. This art has given rise to quite a lucrative industry, popularized by such box office successes as Manhunter and Silence of the Lambs, both of which films featured the fictitious, insane serial killer psychiatrist Dr. Hannibal Lecter, played by Brian Cox and Anthony Hopkins respectively. Psychiatry, being an art, is only as good as the individual practitioner. Mediocre forensic scientists, particularly those in penal and academic circles in America and Britain, smitten by the popular Lecter syndrome, have jockeyed for fame and fortune by loudly proclaiming they have some special psychological insight into the criminal mind. Ironically, one could therefore interpret such a claim as inadvertent admission that they themselves possess more criminal traits and characteristics than average. If lucky enough to have even had one success out of several hundred stabs in the dark, these exponents magnify it by self-publicity and try to found a profitable media career on it. In my opinion, this commercial factor taints and colours all of their works. In reality, the less they perceive, the more others believe, especially police upper echelons, their brains atrophied by abuse of power and expense account alcohol. Based on a study of such self-serving amateurs, I do not hesitate to state that one could achieve a higher percentage of success with a tarot pack. While it is to some extent praiseworthy that urban police outfits recognise the positive potential of expert psychological profilers, namely the FBI unit at Quantico, it is also somewhat perplexing. The scientific methodology refined by expert profilers should be used automatically by anyone claiming to be a professional detective, instead of further straining the thinly spread resources of the Quantico facility. Last but not least, the methodology of second or third rung profits of serial killing profiling is usually plagiarized from research published by the formidable FBI Psychological Profiling Center at Quantico. The media's vested interest is to deliberately inflate, out of greed to sell newspapers and boost TV ratings, an immense and often dangerous public hysteria and panic regarding the serial killer. Can one reasonably doubt that a great volume of sensational publicity generates an unhealthy ethos, in which serial killers are so glamorized, their methodology so widely disseminated, as to tempt others to copy them, if not revere them as prophets of risk and individual action, in a society overwhelmed and bogged down by the dull courtiers and ass-kissers of celebrity culture? To my certain knowledge, a minimum of 6 impressionable individuals have sought to emulate my crimes. 2 killed, were caught and committed suicide. Another 2 are serving life sentences for multiple murder. The remaining 2 are still free and the body count continues to mount. The mere accumulation of forensic information in itself does not predicate expertise. A good profiler must possess instinctive dexterity to juggle multiple concepts and associations with some originality. Genius. The FBI, recently accused of shabby incompetence and misconduct, is not infallible. One very important factor has been completely overlooked by both the shallow and the professional profilers. All intelligent individuals, criminal or otherwise, have a hidden agenda. something so precious to the psyche that it can be confined to no one. Forensic science has not yet triumphed over the stuff as dreams are made on. Therefore, most captured serial killers will confess to any motive in order to conceal the hidden agenda. This not only leaves a significant gap in psychological data, but also introduces wild cards. What is more, it is axiomatic that many criminals themselves have an instinctive or acquired grasp of the forensic sciences. Some are ardent students of published forensic research. Understandably so, their continued freedom or very life literally depends on keeping up to date. Theoretically, the criminal and his empirical practices should always have a competitive edge over academic assumptions. The innovative or inspired pupil invariably drains the master of knowledge and adds it to his own practical expertise. In the course of time, leaps in understanding forensic science are double-edged. A pair of gloves can take care of fingerprints, but how does the killer achieve the more complex task of hiding a crime signature or personality print from the expert profiler? Most of the traits and characteristics that create the crime signature are rooted at a subconscious level, influencing the modus operandi increasingly, especially when murder ceases to be a novelty and becomes merely an unsatisfied contest with the law of diminishing returns. Most power, once attained, becomes a curious, empty experience. Routine is the greatest danger to the security of the serial killer, decreasing his alertness, innovation, and caution. He becomes sloppy. This syndrome also helps to explain, in many instances, why the killer's crimes become more frequent or outrageous. He is chasing a chimera, a homicidal ideal, becoming more frustrated with each successive failure. The murders of Jack the Ripper exemplify both aspects of this syndrome. He, in common with other uncaught serial killers whose crimes mysteriously ceased, perhaps was insightful enough to realize the futility of his search for the ultimate experience, or, conversely, perhaps it was discovered in the final murder. Accepting this premise in general, one might tentatively suggest that the successful criminal student remains undetected mainly by virtue of knowing when to stop. But what of others who do not possess this faculty? How have they avoided capture? Once this type of killer has mastered the psychological principles involved, knowing precisely what the profilers are searching for and tabulating, his next logical step would be to discover the most effective way not only to neutralize the danger, but also shape it to his advantage, like any competent chess player. For instance, as already opined, he may adopt auto-hypnosis techniques to selectively modify the psyche at a subconscious level and systematically create thought processes of a second personality. Or, in Jungian terms, assume the identity of multiple persona to a clinically effective extent, masking and transiently modifying his true thought patterns and emotions, whilst retaining the essential criminal consciousness to exert comprehensive control over his multiple creations. The achievement of conscious control over the subconscious may seem paradoxical or theoretical, but I assure you, from personal study and experience, that it can be accomplished. Raskolnikov, had he applied such auto-hypnosis techniques, would not have been troubled by conscience, the unregulated influence of subconscious social conditioning. Variations of this practical methodology of converting a potential disadvantage to personal advantage could well be applied even more simply in the sophisticated field of genetics, now that law enforcement agencies have publicly and in tactical strategic firms foolishly affirmed their belief that each individual's DNA is practically as unique as their fingerprints. In which case, to fabricate innocence, the criminal needs only a. ensure he leaves no samples of his own DNA at the scene of the crime, b. prior to the crime, obtain by recondite means the DNA substances or traces of some innocent individual to plant on the victim or at the crime scene. Thus, in judo fashion, the strength of almost every advance in forensic science can be turned against itself by the educated criminal. After all, in a general philosophical or theological sense, education is the first step on the road to corruption, the loss of innocence. And, as already touched upon, objective observation of the powerful and influential inculcates that higher education or intelligence should never be automatically equated with higher humanism or lack of criminal tendencies. Further advances in the sphere of genetic research have prompted those with vested interest, political and financial, in the lucrative law enforcement industry, to set up expensive research programs to isolate the killer genes that allegedly develop cold-blooded killers. One must assume the researchers arrogantly mean cold-blooded criminal killers as opposed to cold-blooded legalized killers, and that they can differentiate between the two. In which case, the research becomes patently absurd, a sort of genetic fortune-telling in which the psychic scientists will claim to see invisible black hats on illegal killer genes. A concept crazier, you might think, than the imaginary Star Wars defense dreamt up by President Reagan to ward off the evil empire of Russia. It is therefore significant that the scientists hunting killer genes have begun their research in asylums for the criminally insane, where presumably they feel more at home, less open to criticism, and less constrained by moral and ethical considerations. These genetic boffins, arguably suffering from delusional disorders themselves, hope, rather than justifiably dread, that one day they will be able to identify killer genes in babies and apply preventative drugs, or, more Reagan-like, shoot laser beams at the evil genes. I should point out that I, for one, would not assist in any such research. If they require abnormal personalities to experiment upon, let them use their own, or those of politicians and other power brokers. I believe it was Woody Allen who advanced the theoretical connection between excessive masturbation and those who enter politics. The human propensity to see evil in all others needs no form of further encouragement. Self-delusion is an almost inevitable consequence of life in the modern world, or perhaps even a necessity, to stave off encroaching madness or a collective lemming-like rush to the brink. In my assessment, any person nowadays who does not suffer from some form and degree of personality disorder should, by definition, be regarded as highly suspect, dangerous, and possibly certifiable. At this juncture, let me partly define my relativistic perception or conception of what is meant by criminal. Essentially, to one believing in legal or moral relativism, legalities, moralities, and ethics are simply questions of geography, passing modes of fashion and taste, shaped and dictated by the prevailing ruling class of whatever country one happens to be in at a certain time. In some instances, more from political expediency than altruistic generosity, a few of the laws and morals may, unavoidably, as it were, reflect the wishes and interests of the population as a whole. It therefore follows that criminality is not necessarily indicative of innate evil in any person, nor is an ostensible lack of criminality illustrative of innate good. Both of these polarized conditions are merely personal responses to artificial, externally applied criteria or stimuli imposed by a political minority or capriciously extant majority of conformists upon a more discerning minority of nonconformists. This further postulates that criminality is not always the inherent attribute of a specific act, but often the consequence of a variable power or majority successfully defining said act as criminal. Laws and morals are not guided or decided by divine tablets handed down from the mount, but by secular power or tyranny of numbers. Audience reaction, rather than the discriminating wisdom and inherent superiority of individual judgment, is the critical factor in defining a criminal, an outsider, someone not running with the herd or going with the prevailing popular flow. Quote, "Treason doth never prosper. What's the reason? For if it prosper, none dare call it treason." End quote. Sir John Harrington, 1561 to 1612. If this is accepted as true and valid, one can better understand why the serial killer just as selfishly reasons, why let one's actions be constrained by basic mathematics, vote-hungry politicians, superstitious fear of a supreme being, or indeed anyone at all. Moreover, he may logically conclude it was obviously fortunate that the majority should let their thoughts and horizons be thus restricted. Their critical disability would enhance his personal advantage, existential vitality, and initiative, as well as adding an aesthetic, rounded satisfaction to life in general, and zest to the hunt in particular. He experiences the exhilarating superiority of the freelance predator, each act not only affirming his unfettered existence to the world, but also the failure to succeed by extant codes and rules of society. Knowing his strengths and limitations, he has determined to prove himself a villain, that being the only natural sphere in which he can shine. It is rather significant to note that those members of the lower classes who assiduously adhere to law and prevailing morality usually display a smug self-righteousness, which appears to be based on the patent delusion that their virtuous qualities are inborn rather than evidence of a servile constitution predisposed to the influence of social engineering. Mostly, politicians need to be concerned about programmed public opinion, a fickle state of collective consciousness chiefly created and exploited by themselves and the media for financial or political reward. In reality, the only individuals who have freedom of the press are those who own one. Paradoxically, this pious delusion of innate rectitude in the as yet not caught out population, manages to persist in conjunction with a voracious addiction for every Puritan detail about criminals and their crimes, from which the public obtains vicarious enjoyment and sexual stimulation. In this respect, it could be cynically advanced that criminals provide a necessary cathartic service to society, and, when captured, also serve as sacrificial exhibits upon which to heap collective guilt and sexual frustration, not to mention primal bloodlust. The unpleasant truth, I venture to reiterate, is that many envy the esoteric pleasures and excesses enjoyed by the criminal, who translates their darkest fantasies and desires into action. The common individual craves prohibited sensation minus responsibility and risk, and, perhaps the most psychologically intolerable aspect of all, such people resent inner knowledge that they will spend all their life as timid spectators, never players. They can't quite pull off the trick of fooling themselves or others all of the time, no matter how hard they try to rationalize the undefying reflection of themselves as insatiable voyeurs, luxuriously participating, or anticipating, in forbidden pleasures and deriving compensatory comfort from the misfortune of others. Reading of the murder of strangers makes them feel good to be alive, particularly if sex is also part of the crime. The resulting guilt spurs them to fresh zeniths of clamorous righteousness and revenge. In effect, by entering into a form of collective personality of retribution and purpose, they subliminally absolve themselves of evil recompense and intent, assuaging guilt by self-deceit. Those subject to mob mentality are usually of low intelligence. They fail to recognize that they themselves are victims of the politicians and their minions in the law and order industry, who have personal careers to advance and fresh powers to seek. Having deliberately provoked public panic, the same politicians egocentrically and geocentrically milk it for votes in the role of saviours, creating harsher penalties and promising the mob more to come. A circus. The soft porn tabloids and other sensational media require no remit other than financial gain to devote whole front pages to sex crimes, doing so in loving, salacious detail, exploiting man's lowest instincts and sexual imperatives. Sex crime is reduced to the status of a spectator sport, publicly stimulating for profit the very same feral instincts supposedly possessed by the perpetrator. Such coverage subliminally incites the spectator to gloat over the physical charms of the victim in every respect, imaginatively projecting into the victim's eyes whatever changing reflections of horror or pleasure most excites their recondite inclinations. At breakfast tables all over the country, the sexual appetites of millions of decent citizens are sharpened by such press reports, their readers luxuriating in vivid visions of debauchery, rape, murder, and sadomasochistic perversion, sometimes as perpetrator, sometimes as victim. Death being perhaps the greatest aphrodisiac, feel-good factor, and appetizer there is, readers wolf down the egg and bacon with additional relish, a secular parody of the communion wafer, celebrating life in the midst of random murder. Whenever Puritan reporting acts as a catalyst to some latent killers and rapists, as surely it must, the mass media, with or without the least connecting evidence, conveniently places all the blame on mythical video nasties or hardcore pornography, simultaneously utilizing the opportunity to print or televise many titillating samples of that which they sanctimoniously condemn. It is big business. Morality does not enter into the equation except in the shoddy guise of derisively pious editorials, reminiscent, in shallow sympathy and ersatz horror, of the lucrative ramblings of the late Edgar Lustgarten. This self-styled media criminologist, a jaundice-jowled, lugubrious little specimen with the eyes of a carp, the ethics of a minnow, and the ambience of a ripe red herring, physically personified what every media sensationalist should be obliged to look like as a warning to others. The sensationalists shrewdly appreciate that when it comes to serial killers or killings, the general public has the infinite attention span of lower primates assiduously searching for fleas. As a rule of thumb, conservative politicians, tabloid reporters, pimps and other strangers to ethics who regularly and loudly pontificate on law and order or matters of public morality bear closer investigation. They invariably fulminate in the not-so-ingenuous hope that hot air will waft attention from their own unprepossessing activities and that their bluster will be mistaken for personal virtue and probity. They protest too much. The more they profit from crime, or the darker their hue of chosen vice, the louder they rave for ever harsher penalties for the working-class criminal. The illusion of having a good reputation to maintain can be a most corrupting preoccupation, whereas confessing to a bad reputation is often highly virtuous. Honest criminals are much preferable, more refreshingly wholesome, and cheaper to sustain than conservative politicians. You should never doubt your own experience in favour of other people's opinions, no matter how loftily they berate you with them. Hypocrisy adores exalted heights to condescend from. Experience and instinct caution that one should invariably beware of those who talk much of friendship, loyalty, honesty, and other admirable qualities. They devalue the coin by usage and abusage. Virtue requires no messenger, particularly not a Mercury of the press. Quote, "The man who reads nothing at all is better educated than the man who reads nothing but newspapers." End quote. Thomas Jefferson. Quote, "An editor is a person employed on a newspaper whose business it is to separate the wheat from the chaff and to see that the chaff is printed." End quote. Elbert Hubbard. Quote, "Did you ever notice that when a politician does get an idea, he usually gets it all wrong?" End quote. Don Marquis. Quote, "A sympathizer would seem to imply a certain degree of benevolent feeling. Nothing of the kind. It signifies a ready-made accomplice in any species of political villainy." End quote. Thomas Love Peacock. In close daily association with psychopaths, psychotics, and schizoids, I personally find it easy to differentiate between them, to read them accurately. Your life depends upon it. I have previously listed the salient traits and characteristics of both the criminal and socially acceptable psychopath or sociopath, broadly synthesized as lack of concern and emotional depth in all but self-interest. Devoid of humour, they can nevertheless simulate laughter, bonhomie, and all other social niceties as part of their practised public persona. But the experienced observer will usually detect the hollow tone, the unsmiling eye. In general, they are not susceptible to psychiatric treatment. It is sometimes the case that they slowly mellow with age, but with equal validity, this process could be attributed to declining physical strength in a prison culture where brute force is perhaps the highest value. The deadly monotony and social stagnation of a prison regime naturally debilitates with its mindless repetition and stale conversations. In addition, there is nothing worth striving for if, as many psychopaths are, imprisoned without the possibility of parole. The withering of ambition, desire, and life force in general might generously be regarded by the authorities as mellowing. Dying is a more honest word in a caged place where sleep is the best part left of life, dreams defeating the walls. In such artificial, insular conditions, the psychopaths are generally the least dangerous, as one should always remain alert in their company, never turning one's back, especially on those with paranoid delusions of grandeur or persecution complexes. They may kill you simply to break the boredom, to have something momentarily exciting to do. Contrary to popular belief, not all psychopaths are prone to violence. As previously explained, the general public erroneously connects the term psychopath with murder, when in fact it can be applied to all recurring patterns of criminal behaviour coupled with an inability to learn from past mistakes. Those classified in the remaining psychopathic categories are dangerous in other ways, obsessed with secular power in all its forms. The socially acceptable psychopath, immune from serious prosecution by virtue of influential power and wealth, differs from the more vulnerable criminal breed, to whom money is something to spend freely and enjoy life with, rather than hoard as a power base. In this particular respect, the orthodox criminals are at least more human, more easily satisfied. Childlike, less sophisticated, if you will. They exhibit identifiable desires far easier to comprehend, no matter how abhorrent and selfish their chosen means to an end. They are also, of course, more likely to be caught and heavily punished. The socially acceptable psychopath is quite another kettle of fish. This category shares the same basic pathological traits and characteristics possessed by their less exalted brethren, with some added. Secular power being their aphrodisiac, they can never be satisfied. Obsession drives them relentlessly. Quote, "Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely." End quote. Lord Acton, 1834 to 1902. In prison, I met those few politicians and financiers careless enough to be caught. Their whole manner denoted the conviction that they were not only above the law, but also the architects and swayers of it. They regarded prison as a brief, unjust, temporary setback, which their power and wealth would eventually overcome. A slight slip-up their influential friends would not hold against them when released to re-enter the high social strata. As previously indicated, statistics show that this elite category of socially acceptable psychopath collectively deprives society of more wealth than their blue-collar opposites, and with less excuse, the former having had superior education and a privileged upbringing. Their easy air of effete affection was reminiscent of the French aristocracy before the tumbrils and heads began to roll. However, unlike their decapitated approximates, the confidence of these modern-day tyrants is rather more justified, so securely are they protected by the forces of law and order they themselves create and treat with such contempt. Mass communication rubs salt in the wounds of the servile almost daily by reporting how the high and mighty invariably escape imprisonment or suffer no stigma when released. Ousted dictators can flee to the West with billions of dollars stolen from their country's treasury, confident they will be received like visiting royalty, whereas some little gangster trying to escape justice abroad would be imprisoned immediately. Steal an apple, you are a thief. Steal a country, you are a statesman. Moral relativism, therefore, indicates the bigger the crime, you do no time. Those very same pillars of the community who bay for harsher prison sentences and capital punishment for petty criminals obsequiously wine, dine, and lionize exiled financiers and plundering dictators. Such moral, legal, and social distinctions have always clearly illustrated that judgment and penalty are tempered according to wealth and privilege, an irrefutable fact that should reinforce relativism in all discerning individuals. The Manson family effectively taught the wealthy that they are not beyond the reach and reproach of the activist subculture, as evidenced, quote, anyone can be killed, even the president, end quote. Society, if you believe such a thing exists, trains and constrains the individual to counterfeit surface respect for powerful personages and outmoded conventions which, in truth, the large majority abhor and despise. Therefore, there exists in every free-thinking person a tenacious tension between that which they know to be their genuine beliefs and desires and the grotesque proprieties and social protocols they reluctantly pay homage to under duress. The resulting psychic conflict creates a neurotic self-contempt, a mordant doubt that they possess the will or spiritual strength needed to throw off such tight bridles and assert unconditional individuality, even at the risk of their disconsolate lives. Contrary to Ian Fleming, you only live once. Therefore, a person should consciously choose whether to exist as a grey daub on a grey canvas, or as an existential riot of every colour in the spectrum. You know which of these alternatives the serial killer selects. Action painting with his knife on a human canvas, each slash-splash creating a unique masterpiece. Not for sale, but nevertheless widely viewed with fascination by most. One should be fully aware of the respective relative merits of those complementary qualities deemed good or evil before daring to pontificate upon them. Society demands, for reason of social control, that the criminal, having experienced, enjoyed, and practiced both good and evil with more or less equal enthusiasm, should recant his unorthodox beliefs and actions simply because an error of judgment led to his capture. Had he not been captured, would the criminal then have been expected to renounce all his good qualities in a similar manner? This essentially artificial, impossible demand for a moral dichotomy, which excludes one of two contrasting qualities that in reality constitute a unity, is the height of human folly. By all means, punish or execute transgressors, but do not bore them to death with concepts based entirely on social engineering, flatteringly disguised as divine wisdom. Returning to forensic matters, paranoid schizoids are, by definition, less predictable than psychopaths, and are therefore, in some instances, more dangerous. Many are lost in a whirlwind cycle of hallucination and grand delusion, tranquil and normal one moment, raging and violent the next. Beyond accurate prognosis, they can, nevertheless, be stabilized to an effective degree by drug therapy, but on the whole must be regarded as an almost permanent potential menace to themselves and others. Sometimes many appear normal for such lengthy periods that one becomes careless and relaxes. Then the explosion of violence catches you off balance. Yet certain other schizoids are comparatively harmless, reacting mainly to their imaginary inner experiences rather than their surroundings. Many, under strictly supervised medication, can be kept as normal as the next person, but one still has to remain alert for those who decide they no longer need medication and surreptitiously spit it out. I personally consider psychotics the most interesting. When not in a state of cyclical manic depression or lost in a schizophrenic fugue. They are energetic in mind and body, swinging from tears to laughter, constantly bubbling with ideas and startling momentary insights, treating morals and legalities as malleable playthings. They often exhibit a high sense of absurdity, combined with acute observation of man's foibles. This invariably results in a cavalier, bold, and arrogant attitude to all matters, including murder. They, quote, view the world from the edge of a far star, end quote. Should they respect or learn from the conduct of their sane mentors, who exemplify and justify tribal mayhem? Over 50 million people died in World War II. It reads more like a league table than an Everest of bodies. How many centuries would you suppose it would take for freelance criminals and madmen to equal the numerical carnage the law-abiding and sane can achieve in such a comparatively short space of time? One should cultivate discrimination in accepting or respecting one's moral superiors. So often they are certainly not. Do you not find it at all intriguing and incongruous, as I do, that the political and military killers show none of the guilt or remorse society so eagerly demands from lesser criminals? Why is this? Because society has given the former permission to openly indulge, glory, and exult in unlimited slaughter and panoramic devastation. For an intelligent discussion of this question, we should ignore such absurd rationalizations as, "But that's war." Convenient psychological sophistry manifests itself in other bewitching ways. Why are the mass media and the general public so fascinated by serial killers, yet show not the least interest in, and, quite frankly, absolute boredom with, far more prolific, legalized killers? Say, an American pilot in Vietnam whose daily routine task was to fry alive in napalm thousands of men, women and children. Or the American Special Forces, who habitually cut off the ears of the enemy as trophies and made necklaces of them. The American public displayed no shock over such atrocities, but expressed horror and revulsion over a simulated mutilation in the film Reservoir Dogs, where a character cuts off a policeman's ear. It becomes transparent that the reason why the media and public are so fascinated by serial killers is that these people kill at will, requiring no legislation, without asking for or needing permission, the very concept never entering their mind. The same morbid syndrome exists in all countries, of course. The 5 murders committed by Jack the Ripper in England over a century ago are found to be far more internationally intriguing than 6 million murdered in the German concentration camps of Heinrich Himmler. Everyone knows about the Boston Strangler murders, but how many can easily recall who was president or attorney general at the time? Fickle fame and infamy. You may have already deduced that the teams of prominent psychiatric consultants who have attempted to interview and categorize me over the years classify me as a psychotic. Arose by any other name, quote, "Though they go mad, they shall be sane. Though they sink through the sea, they shall rise again." End quote. Dylan Thomas. Even the wildest spirit is, in action, unavoidably crippled by what moralists term conscience, and also by one of the most debilitating, insidious cankers of all, timidity. The Napoleons are exceptions, as Dostoevsky's Raskolnikov belatedly discovered to his cost. At the point of death, I suggest that most of you will not regret what you have done in life, but what you have left undone through defective anxiety and trepidation. you too shall, quote, rage against the dying of the light, end quote, cursing a lifetime of missed opportunities and the dourness of sanity. Many cultures believe, rightly or wrongly, that the mad have a touch of divinity about them, that they perhaps reach upwards and downwards just that little bit further than most of their sane brethren, that they enjoy a richer experience of life. The fool on the hill syndrome. Putting to one side the caution of legal definition, intuition suggests that a great many members of the public equate serial killing with insanity, but atavistically desire to execute the perpetrators anyway. I have no quarrel with this. Official murder is the triumphant exoneration of relativism. However, let us examine a few misconceptions. I believe the term serial killer is highly misleading, in that it implicitly suggests to the general public that murder is the paramount object or motivating urge in the mind of the killer. The vast majority of the public, having never experienced what it means to kill another human being in cold blood, or hot for that matter, nevertheless readily assumes or accepts that the serial killer's main object must be murder. They naturally attribute this motivation partly because they value human life above all else, and partly because, as their endless fascination with the subject suggests, they have a vague conception of murder as being a somehow mystical, highly dramatic, or even nebulously romantic experience, with sophisticated or unimaginable connotations of eroticism. And guilt must be paid for in full. People mostly dream of killing a hated enemy, not realizing that it would be far more satisfying to inflict significant injury, leaving the enemy alive to endure it, or commit suicide. This concisely illustrates the predatory compulsion to view the taking of a life as the be-all and end-all. But it also exemplifies that there are crimes far worse than dealing out blessed oblivion. Of course, there are many serial killers to whom murder is the prime motivation. Perhaps they lack the capacity to ponder the matter in abstract philosophical terms, probably because the metaphysical aspect, the sense of making their mark in the universe, metaphorically challenging God, is the most powerful. This significant metaphysical factor is, to a greater or lesser degree, innate not only in all serial killers but also in the majority of thinking individuals, which accounts for the popular captivation or enchantment of murder. But personally, I have met only a few such death-fixated serial killers, despite having rubbed shoulders with a considerable variety over the years. And, contrary to current notions in popular fiction, I believe most serial killers seldom develop a taste for killing per se. Ironically, however, it is within the ranks of the domestic murderers, non-serial killers, that you will find many whose main purpose was murder, perhaps to rid themselves of a nagging or unfaithful partner, or collect life insurance, or marry a lover, etc. Obviously, the motivating factor in such cases is personal gain of some sort, but by deliberate homicide. What the average, if one can use the term in this context, serial killer seeks, above all, is power, and the will to power. In this psychic ambience, power and sex are often synonymous or complementary. Commitment to a personal system which relegates external legality, morality, and ethics to mere serendipity, random leaves blowing from a moribund tree, can be arrived at via disparate emotional routes or routes. Some may find a philosophy of cosmetic uncertainty joyful and stimulating, and dance happily and harmlessly through life, their innocence a positive inspiration and boon to their fellow voyagers. Yet a lack of moral and ethical certitude is automatically assumed by most to be on the whole undesirable, something either akin to or equivalent to evil. The colour of a guide dog may be black or white, but what matters is that it takes us in the direction we wish to go. I think it can be stated with certainty that the serial killer's consciously or subconsciously chosen path is towards perdition and desirable oblivion. However, he may travel that road just as exuberantly and light-heartedly as the innocent travels his. Having determined and resigned himself to the fact that life is meaningless and that synthetic systems of probity only tend to make the journey more tedious, what could be more natural than that he consciously decides to sample every variety of spiritual and physical excitement that attracts his interest, perfectly aware of and willing to accept the secular consequences of his actions? The rewards of good or evil are just as satisfying to the adherent of either. Essentially, I posit that there is no such thing as an unselfish act, though theologians and moralists might argue otherwise. We do whatever we enjoy doing. Whether it happens to be judged good or evil is a matter for others to decide. Returning to the psychological and physical logistics, once the serial killer's power or sex urge is satisfied, he is left with the unfortunate living witness to it, the victim. He is therefore logically and emotionally compelled to kill the victim, simply as a secondary expedient, to escape the legal and psychological consequences of what he perceives to be his major crime. The first killing experience will not only hold the strongest element of existential novelty and curiosity, but also the greatest element of danger and trepidation conjured by the unknown. Usually, the incipient serial killer is too immersed in the psychological and legal challenges of the initial homicide, not to mention immediate logistics, the physical labour that the killing and disposal involve. He is therefore not in a condition to form a detached appreciation of the traumatic complexities bombarding his senses. You could, in many instances, describe the experience as an affective state of shock. He is, after all, storming pell-mell the defensive social conditioning of a lifetime, as well as declaring war upon all the organised, regulatory forces of society. In extinguishing someone's life, he is also committing his own, and has no time to stop and stare in the hazardous psychological battlefield. In another very significant sense, he is killing his long-accepted self as well as the victim, and simultaneously giving birth to a new persona, decisively cutting the umbilical connection between himself and ordinary mankind. Having fought his former self and won, the fledgling serial killer flexes newfound powers with more confidence. The second killing will hold all the same disadvantageous, distracting elements of the first, but to a lesser degree. This allows a more objective assimilation of the experience. It also fosters an expanding sense of omnipotence, a wide-angle view of the metaphysical chessboard. In many cases, the element of elevated aestheticism in the second murder will exert a far more formative impression than the first, and probably of any in the future. It not only represents the rite of confirmation, a revelational leap of lack of faith in humanity, but also the onset of addiction to hedonistic nihilism, the psychic abolition of redemption, End of chapter 5.